My name's Tom Bartholomew, and I'm on the faculty of Rutgers University, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. And today I'm going to be presenting on best practices in restorative supervision. This is one of my all-time favorite topics, and I hope you like it. So today, hopefully the training will last hopefully about an hour, and I'm going to look at the three functions of supervision. And it could be clinical supervision or really any type of supervision. And then look at the tension between restorative and the normative functions, and I'll describe what that means. And also we're going to learn to FIDWIS, because we all know we need to do that, and understand the dangers of emotional labor, which if you're watching this, you likely work in a field that engages in emotional labor. And lastly, we're going to learn at least 3 strategies for use in doing restorative supervision. All right, so there were some things that didn't seem to fit anywhere else, so I just made a random slide. The first thing is, why do supervision at all? And supervision is about accomplishing the mission of the organization. That's what it is. It's not therapy. Now there's a lot of pieces that go into accomplishing the mission, and we'll talk about some of them. Also, and this maybe is provocative, but this idea that organizations or employers have a duty to protect their workers. And we'll talk a little bit about, I'll talk because I'm talking, about physical labor. So if you work in a slaughterhouse, for example, the employer has a duty to protect you from the dangerous saws and things that are going on in that workplace. Something else that you see in reading about supervision is that bad supervision is really bad, and it's worse than good supervision is good. I know that's a little bit of a tongue twister, but so you really want to avoid bad supervision. I mentioned before, supervision is not therapy, and so when we talk about a supervisor having a role in a restorative role in the work life of an employee, we have to have some boundaries around that, right? Because it's not therapy. And that lastly, and particularly in the state hospital systems, it's understood that there are important informal supports that exist within these institutions, and we wouldn't want to end that. What I'm talking about are the formal supports, what the organization owes its employees and should be providing. So if you've heard me speak in the area of clinical supervision, you've heard me talk about these 3 functions of supervision. And virtually all models of supervision address these in one way or another. Some are very strong in one area and very weak in another area. And some, particularly something called administrative supervision, might be entirely normative. But anyway, we're going to just review very quickly what do I mean by restorative, formative, and normative. We use this because it rhymes, right? So the restorative function is about supporting the employee. And depending on the nature of the work that employee is doing, it could be offering protective gear, it could be a respirator, whatever. But what we're going to be talking about today is kind of in the area of emotional labor. What does that look like? And one thing that has been shown to be very helpful is this idea of reflective practice or mindfulness, and we'll talk about that going forward, as well as team building and promoting self-care. So restorative is the support function of supervision to help restore employees so they can help accomplish the mission. Next, we have the formative function. And the formative function is the teaching function, right? Or the education function. And in developmental models of supervision, this is really a focus. So if somebody's is new to the field, they need education in what to do, and they need guidance, that kind of thing. Just a side note, one of the differences between coaching and mentoring and supervision is that supervision tends to have an evaluative component, right? So there's an evaluation that occurs. All right, so the formative function is the educational function. And lastly, the normative function is the accountability function. And some supervisors are really strong in this area, and it's all about accountability, right? And you might call them administrative supervisors because that is their whole focus. And there's a role for that and a place for that, absolutely. So here's a pro tip. The first pro tip coming from me is that if issues come up in supervision that don't seem to belong in supervision, particularly clinical supervision, you want a mechanism to bump those issues up into the leadership if there are levels of leadership above you, particularly if you're in a large organization. So that's pro tip number one. Be prepared to bump up important issues to leadership. All right, so we got the three functions. What are the three functions again? Oh, restorative, formative, and normative. So the support function, the teaching or educational function, and the accountability or administrative function. All of these are really, really important, and all models of supervision address these three or are stronger in one than the other. All right. So when you think of these three functions, there's a natural tension that exists between the restorative and normative functions. So the support function and the accountability function. In order to support someone, you want them to feel safe and they're in a trusting environment, a place they can be vulnerable. And at the same time, you want to hold them accountable for good work. And gosh forbid, you may need to let them go if they're not doing good work and they're not meeting the conditions for employment. So this is critically important and comes to pro tip number two. If you can separate these two functions, if you can separate the support or restorative function from the accountability or normative function, that's really helpful. And I completely get it if you can't, because a lot of organizations are simply too small or they're just not set up to do this. And it absolutely, supervisors can resolve this tension effectively, and they do it all the time. But it is the work of the supervisor to do that. And, so this idea of this tension, it raises this idea of, is supervision about scrutiny, or is it about support, or is it about both? And unfortunately, often we think of supervision as snoopervision, right? Where there's, the supervisor's job is to watch over you. It's not necessarily to support you. And I'm going to make a case, I think an incredibly strong case today, that we need to focus on the support aspect of supervision if we're going to do good work in the area of mental health, particularly. So why do restorative supervision? I think it's because of this guy. At least I think that's Robert Karasak. That's what it said on the internet. And he did a good deal of research, which I read a lot of it, and it resulted in two large, what are called meta-analyses, which they just took hundreds of studies and they tried to discern from these hundreds of studies, could they validate his theories. And basically his theory is that your job can hurt you. And he had a recipe for just how to do that. And these, interestingly, in the second meta-analysis at the end, it said something I've never seen in really almost any study. It said, we don't need to study this anymore. This is true. Like, the evidence is so compelling that Robert Karasak had it right. And so let's just dig in a little bit to what he was talking about. So what he said was, if you have a job that has high demands on you, and they could be physical demands, they could be emotional demands, whatever. And along with those high demands comes low control. So you can imagine somebody on an assembly line, you got to work at a certain pace, and you have no control. You can't get up and just walk around and talk to your friends. You got to work. And then the last piece, which came later in this study, was this idea of low support. So if you have these three conditions, high demands, low control, and low support, you will find workers with various types of illnesses and what we call burnout. And we're going to define that and talk about that going forward. And it's interesting, I heard on National Public Radio a study. They were talking about CEOs of companies, And CEOs often are not burnt out. They're actually in great shape. And from Karasak's theory, you might say, well, do they have high demands? Yeah, probably, right? Do they have low control? No, they actually don't have low control. In many ways, certainly nobody has, complete control. And whether or not they have support or not is a good question. Now, depending on how you define support, they may have layers of lieutenants, that are there to work for them, in which case that would be a type of support, right? All right, whoops. All right, next thing. So one issue is going to be the difference between physical labor and emotional labor. This is where we're going. And so if you want to really focus on mental health burnout and forget about the physical consequences for just a minute, you can add to this recipe, right? You can make it a little spicier, add a dash of exposure to trauma, to other people's trauma, even your own trauma. And there's very good evidence that can harm employees. And then, of course, add the corona pandemic. Boy, you've got some a spicy recipe right there. So this is why we're going to be talking about restorative supervision. Because your job can hurt you, and particularly if you're working in mental health, there are unique stressors that we can address, right, in restorative supervision. So, of course, the buffering hypothesis, based on Karasak, you realize it's demand control support, which is what it's called, demand control support. And the buffering hypothesis was that if you had enough support that you could mediate the demands and the low control. And it turns out that there is evidence for this, and it's not 100%. If your job really, really sucks, you might want to get out of that job, right? You can certainly, attempt adding as much support as you can, but there may come a point where your job sucks, right? That's just reality. So this brings us to the first fork in the road, and there is the fork. And that fork is a distinction between physical labor and emotional labor. And I had honestly never heard of the term emotional labor until I was reading about Robert Karasak and in the area of industrial psychology. All right, so let's look at this a little bit. So this may be a provocative statement, but I think it's true. So organizations or employers have a duty to protect their workers. And so you see in these two photos, you've got somebody cutting lumber, and he's got what look like leather chaps and ear protection and a hard hat and an orange shirt. And on the other side, these guys don't look that safe, frankly, but they've got hard hats, which I'm sure would help them if they fell off that beam. So I don't think I'm going to get an argument from you guys, particularly because there are no you guys. I'm just recording this. All right, but organizations have a duty to protect their workers. So our work, or at least the people that work in mental health, is, I just want to make sure I'm recording. Yes. The work in mental health is of a particular type, and it doesn't have a lot of physical components, but I think it does have at least one physical component, and that is ergonomics, right? And that's true for anybody if you work at a desk or have a workstation. This is an area that we can focus on as a way to try to support our staff, but it will be the only area in the physical domain that we'll look at today. And so what can you do? FIDWIS, right? I coined this term. I should probably get money for this. And what is FIDWIS? It's fix your damn workstation. And as I speak, I'm sitting in this kneeling chair because I hurt my back. So I'm pretty aware of how badly people can arrange their workstation. So we're not going to spend any more time on it, but give it a look. This is what you want to look at, like, right? You want your screen at eye level. You want to adjust your desk. You want to adjust your chair. And don't look like this guy, which is most of my colleagues at one point or another look like this. All right, but that's not what we're really interested in today, right? What we're actually interested in is this idea of emotional labor. And in the literature, it was defined as emotions sold for a wage. And so my question is, if we recognize that employers have a role in protecting their employees in the physical domain, right? What is the role and what are the dangers of people doing emotional labor, right? So are there threats to doing emotional labor, and do our employees and organizations have a duty to protect us? So I just thought this picture was hilarious. So my mother used to say the plumber's pipes are always leaking, and her father, my grandfather, was a plumber, so I guess she knew what she was talking about. And what's really funny about this photo, if you look closely, it looks like there's another hand going up between the guy's arms. So there's like somebody underneath that water spray. If you can't see the slide, it's this dude trying to fix a pipe that's just blowing out what looks like water. And there's apparently another guy there. Anyway, I just thought that was funny. Oh, so what is this? Why am I showing you this? Well, it's been my experience that people in mental health, that work in mental health, often are very skilled at promoting mental health, in teaching people the skills of mental health and recognizing problems and that kind of thing. I think we stink at doing it ourselves, or for the people around us. I'm not going to bet money. I would bet money, actually, because I'm pretty confident about that. So what are the dangers of emotional labor? And now, emotional labor goes everywhere from retail, right? If you go to buy a pack of gum, the person behind the counter is not allowed to be like, they're not allowed. They have to be in a particular emotional state. It's what emotional labor is about, is that you're paying a person to not be a jerk, right? The classic example are stewards in airplanes, where they're like, bye-bye, 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 bye-bye. And if you were to watch them after everybody's gone, they just go right to neutral. They're not actually happy. Maybe they're happy you're leaving, but and so what they're doing is they're getting themselves in this emotional state because that's the job, right? So it's emotions sold for a wage. So what are the dangers? Well, it can be really stressful, particularly if the person you're working with is a jerk, right? And you have to be supportive in this space, no matter what they do. You're not allowed to slap them or scream at them, right? And what can this do? Well, we're going to talk about is it can produce miserable staff. If you're not able to be in that space for one reason or another, it can make you miserable. Emotional labor can result in low organizational commitment, poor treatment outcomes. You probably heard these terms: vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue and burnout, et cetera. So there's actually quite a number of dangers to this notion of emotional labor. So I just want to define a couple of these. I am not an expert in vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. They look awfully similar, at least in these definitions. But vicarious trauma is this idea of you're interacting with people that have been traumatized. You can begin to experience that trauma yourselves, right? The horror of, just hearing the story and connecting with what that must have felt like, right? And the next one, compassion fatigue, is just when you become preoccupied with the trauma of the people you work with. So there's probably better definitions and somebody better to talk about it. But what I do know something about is coming up is called burnout. But before we get there, I read recently, and I did not know this idea that empathy is not the same as compassion. And I would have used them interchangeably probably, right? But according to what I was reading, empathy refers to the feeling someone else's feelings, right? And getting in their shoes, right? And there's part of why we do this kind of work is we generally are empathetic people. They're capable of empathy. Whereas compassion is when those feelings and thoughts include the desire to help. And this woman, Tanya Singer, has studied this, and she may be the world's leading authority in the empathy versus compassion. But what she said is that empathy gets fatigued, not compassion. And what she has learned in studying these concepts is that empathy can hurt you in the sense that if you're feeling someone else's pain constantly, particularly if the people you work with are in pain, and they are often, that can become overwhelming and lead to the things that described before. So she would say, I believe, that it's not compassion fatigue, it's empathy fatigue. And so we can focus on the desire to help. And yes, empathy is the door into wanting to help, but we don't want to stay there, according to Singer's work. And there's some references there if you're interested. Or just, best thing to do, just Google Tanya Singer compassion. And it's pretty impressive, actually. All right, so here's something I know something about. And I've been working in this area. I've done a large study in New Jersey on burnout of staff in the state psychiatric hospitals. So burnout is characterized by 3 dimensions. And the first one is exhaustion. And it can be physical exhaustion or emotional exhaustion, just, you know, this idea of empathy fatigue or compassion fatigue. The second one is this, in an effort for staff who are feeling overwhelmed and overdrawn to protect themselves, they may engage in what is called depersonalization, which is you just push the problems away. Or it's like you're not even a person. You know, like I can't deal with anymore. And if you're a parent, I'm guessing you know what this is like. There's a limit. Everybody has a limit. And then the last part of this syndrome called burnout is an understanding that you're not so good at your job anymore. Once you can't tolerate the additional demands of clients and you're constantly overwhelmed, the person recognizes that they're burnt out and that they're not doing a great job professionally. I think what's important about this concept of burnout is that we have to be careful that it's like using the term love. You can say, I love my toilet paper, I love this casserole, or I love my mother, or I love my child, right? That we overuse these terms. And so you say, oh, I'm so burnt out today. Yeah, this is a syndrome where it's ongoing, right? And when that happens, when a person gets into this ongoing burnt out place, it leads to terrible consequences, and it's not a funny thing at all. So part of my research was looking at the fact that people that score high in burnout are assaulted more by their clients. I mean, think about that, right? If you're pushing people away to protect yourself, maybe they don't like that. Reduced professional work, job satisfaction, breaches in ethical contact, lower productivity. Increase in physical and mental health related disorders. So anxiety, depression, you actually can become physically ill. And this is what Karasek was talking about, that when the conditions of a job are just so, employees are harmed. And then something I think many of us have experienced is this negative contagion effect that somebody that's burned out has on their teammates. And I think, at least I have experienced this, where you're in a pretty good mood, you go into the team, and there's just somebody there that's going to tell you every negative thing that's happened. And I don't even blame them, because in a way, I think they're a victim sometimes of poor job designs and lack of support. But in any event, they're suffering. Somebody that's burnt out is suffering. And then lastly, a negative spillover effect on home life. And this includes more marital problems, domestic abuse, drug and alcohol use, all of that. So this is bad. It's really bad. Burnout is bad. So this brings us to the second fork in our road, double fork. And was it Yogi Berra who said, when you come to the fork in the road, take it? Which is any discussion about burnout, you have to talk about life-work balance, right? So everybody has their life and then they go to work. And sometimes you're bringing so much stress from your life that it's not your work's fault, right? That, you know, you may be going through a divorce or some, you know, serious health problem or any health problem, really. And so we want to talk about this balance of personal and professional self-care. So second fork of the road, personal and professional. So here's where it gets dangerous, right? So is it the supervisor's job to help somebody with their home problems, right? If they're going to have a divorce, or the answer is no. No, it isn't. It is the supervisor's job to address work-related stressors and to encourage somebody to take care of themselves and maybe go for therapy or, you know, reach out for support, take some time off, you know, maybe counsel them out of the profession. Maybe it's possible. And also providing information on what, you know, what has worked for them, what are some options for self-care, promoting support from others. And again, here is the slippery slope, is that this is absolutely true for work stressors and a person's work life. When it comes to a person's personal life, you know, I would encourage them to seek support as they need it, you know, from professionals or others. And then here, this last element here, encouraging open discussions about vulnerability. And what do I mean by that? So, and this is where maybe it gets kind of provocative, but it's been my experience that if you're doing work with trauma survivors or people in serious, difficult times in their life, it becomes critically important for the person doing the treatment to have a place where they can talk about how they are doing, how they are actually doing, and to process some of that. And so this is what I mean about encouraging open discussions about vulnerability. I don't know why it says in open discussion. But. All right, so pro tip number 3. This is something I stole from somewhere, which I forgot, but whoever said it, it's a good idea. But it's the idea that I used to think that if I'm in a trusting environment, I'm going to be more willing to be vulnerable, right? And that's true. But it turns out that trusting environments are created by somebody being vulnerable. So for example, if we were to do a round and we were going to talk about how the corona pandemic is affecting us, and the first person starts out and they say like, oh, I find myself listening to a lot more music, and the next person's like, yeah, I've been eating a lot of ice cream and stuff. Right? You can see there's a level there, right? There's a level of sharing. Imagine if I started and I said, I find myself really struggling with worry, and I find myself sitting and kind of being overwhelmed with worrying about my kids and worrying about my job and worrying about my finances. So I'm really suffering, right? I don't think the next person would say, yeah, I'm listening to a lot more music. You see what I'm getting at? That kind of vulnerability leads to vulnerability and leads to trust in the group. And there's a limit, of course, to everything. But that's pro tip number 3. All right. So what can supervisors do, and what are ways to think about it? So I stole this from Joni Dolce, and I think she's at this conference. She's probably showing the same slide, but listen, I gave her credit. But it's just this idea of this ABCs, ways of remembering. So awareness, balance, and connection. So let's look at doing a chaos inventory, which is my way of, or a way of developing awareness. And how do you do a chaos inventory? So it's the idea of inventorying the chaos in your life. And what do I mean by that? So stress shows up in areas of our lives, even if we're not particularly aware that that's what it is. And I'll tell you what I mean here. And so I'd like you to do a chaos inventory with me. And let's look at these domains of wellness. This comes, I think, from Peggy Swerbrick in my department. And so it's the 8 domains of wellness or chaos. So emotional, financial, intellectual, vocational, social, physical, environmental, spiritual, and emotional. I don't know if you want to do them all, but you might just look at, is there an area of one of these 8 domains that it feels chaotic to you. A friend of mine said when his life becomes chaotic, his car just fills up with junk and he doesn't clean it, and it's a mess. And that's one of the first signs. For me, I hurt myself, like I hurt my back, or I pull my neck, or I'm carrying tension, things like that. So if you're going to do a chaos inventory, where do you see the stress in your life popping out? Are you spending more? Do you find yourself being sad? Is your house incredibly filthy and untidy, or incredibly clean and tidy? That's the other. Could go either way. I had a spiritual practice of meditating every morning, and I would sit and do breathing exercises where I would say count to 10. I'd go breathe in 1, breathe out 1, breathe in 2, breathe out 2. And now I find myself, I get to like 2 and I'm worrying about something, right? So that's how one of the other ways it's playing out for me. So just take a minute, and if you're comfortable and you want to put it in the chat, where do you see the stress of your life squeezing out? It's a great exercise to do in teams or in groups. That just begins the process of being willing and able to be vulnerable, in a safe place to be vulnerable about how people are doing. These domains can function at work too, right? So I don't know about work, but I watch Family Guy when I'm stressed out. So I'm not doing that at work. I mean, of course I work at home, so I guess I am doing that at work. Whatever. All right. So that's called the chaos inventory. And I encourage you to try this. It can be really eye-opening and help with awareness. So what are some exercises for use in the restorative group supervision? So chaos inventory we talked about. So let's talk a little bit about mindfulness exercises and team building and burnout meter and the self-care rounds. Just very briefly talk about some of these techniques and how they might be helpful. So what is mindfulness? This comes from a group in Toronto that's been studying mindfulness. An awareness of the current moment without judgment. So this really can be anything. In fact, there's a fellow named Thich Nhat Hanh that writes books on mindfulness, and it, every book is like, eating, breathing, seeing. I actually put pooping there. I don't know if you want to do a mindful exercise and pooping in a group. That's up to you. Like, listen, people are into different things. It's just the way it is. If you want a list of these, and actually there are website, my group's website is at the bottom. I encourage you to check it out. There's a lot of resources there. And I will put it in the chat box. Actually, my Wrangler will put it in the chat box if she can figure out how to do it. That's you, Sarah, right? Yeah, it was kind of funny though, mindful pooping. All right, I'll leave it there. I mean, I won't leave it, whatever. Okay, so why is mindfulness restorative? And I've often wondered this, and I think I got it. What mindfulness does, if you practice it over time, it allows you to be present enough to employ a skill, right? So I was teaching a skills group at a state psychiatric hospital, and I was struck by how the folks just learned them like a lot faster than you would imagine. And it occurred to me that it wasn't that they didn't have the skills, they didn't use the skills, right? And what the group allowed was some awareness to, like, let's start using this skill, because this guy Tom wants us to use the skill. But think about, like, do you guys know how to lose weight? Do you know how to exercise? Do you know how to go dancing? Do you know how to take care of yourself? Do you know, right? Yes, we do, but do we do it? And that's where mindfulness, that if you get into a place where you can kind of take an inventory without judgment, it can lead you to make some really good and important choices. All right, that's why mindfulness can be restorative, because it can be a linking skill. It can also be very calming and satisfying once you practice it long enough. All right, here's another exercise we can do. It's simply to go around, do a round within a group where you just on a scale of 0 to 10, how burnt out are you, right? And we don't have to use the syndrome burnout in this case, but how are you feeling on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being like my head's on fire, or 0, I'm doing great. I'm there for other people because I'm doing so well. So as you'll note, a lot of these are rounds, and this should be a pro tip, but one of the things I found helpful is to have a different person facilitate a different exercise each time the group meets. So it reduces passivity in the group, and it just encourages ownership, which I guess is reducing passivity. But this could be a terrific. So if somebody is saying, that I'm really not doing well, we can reach out and try to support them best we can. So here's a team building exercise I've used many times. And you may have been a team for years. It's just like I did this with a group that had been at the state psychiatric hospital. They've been working together for a long time. We just simply had people interview one another. And what are your hobbies? What are you most proud of? Right? At the end of the exercise, I had people come up to me and say, like, I've worked with these people for years. I didn't know anything about them, right? Because they really stayed in this professional zone, which I don't think you have to stay in that professional zone personally if you're going to be doing this kind of work. I don't know that it's advisable. All right, a self-care round. So I was doing a training, and the psychologist said to me, as psychologists, we know that we need as much caretaking as our clients. And honestly, I was so shocked by that. I think it's true, right? But I don't get as much caretaking as my clients. But in any event, this exercise, the self-care round, is simply, you just do a round and you talk about how are you taking care of yourself. And it can be in a professional domain at work, or it could be, a walking routine at home, or attending church, or whatever it is. But this has been one you can go back to, because oftentimes somebody's taking care of themselves 1 week, and 2 weeks later, not so much. If people stink at this, and I've come out to Washington State and done presentations and done this exercise, and there was a group of supervisors who said, oh, we kind of suck at this. And so they each made a commitment to taking on some new self-care, making a commitment to practice some new self-care activity. I never went back to find out if they did it, but let's assume they did. So these next few slides are actually slides. This is a plastic blue and red slide. And this slide it's got an extra hump, which is quite nice. And it is a yellow, green, and red slide. All right, so let's look at the pro tip reviews. Pro tip number 1, bump up important issues to leadership. So if you're doing any kind of supervision and the same thing just keeps bogging down your supervision, you may consider bumping it up to leadership and say, we have an issue. I supervise a lot of staff that run groups, and they may say, we can't get the people from the hospital units to the group on time, and we can't talk about that every day in supervision, right? That's not in the sphere of influence of supervision. And so we're going to bump that up to leadership to fix that. Pro tip number 2, if possible, separate the support and accountability functions in supervision, the restorative and normative functions, separate them. And what I mean by that is have someone else do the restorative supervision and someone else do the administrative supervision if you can, or pieces of it. Pro tip number 3, vulnerability creates trust, not the other way around. So if you're a supervisor, consider whatever you're comfortable with, but consider being vulnerable yourself, right? If you're having a hard time, say like, I'm having a hard time. You're not asking for your supervisees to do therapy, but you are communicating to them that you can be vulnerable in this space. And this pro tip we didn't talk about, but it's been my experience that some of the people most in need of restorative supervision are supervisors. And so supervisors need support too. And my group, we developed what we call meta supervision. It's supervision for supervisors, and we work on best practice supervision strategies that the supervisors can use. But we also do a heavy duty restorative focus. So that's it. Thank you so much for spending the time with me and listening to a little bit about restorative supervision.